Okay, let's try a script that takes a curve and tries to trace that um, curve, making sort of growing lines or iterations like in the video that we saw in class. So let's start out first with a circle. I lost my import somewhere. Okay, just looking in top view. And let's give it a radius of 10. Okay, so that's gonna be our starting curve, and then we're gonna go through, and what we want to do is kind of trace it kind of close, but give it some variation, like the hand drawing that was happening before. Um, and so if we want to do that, let's break it up into points. We'll just divide the curve, get some points. We can then move these points and then redraw the curve, and it'll give us a new curve. So if we want to move these points, we'll give it some sort of vector to move. So let's try giving it a vector from the center point to these new points. So that's vector 2 point. And if we look at that through a vector display, we plug in where the point is and the vector directions, you can see that we want those to move out. So those are pretty big. So if you right click on the U, you can unitize that and just make it a distance of 1. Okay. So we have that vector, we can then move these points. And it moves them out like that. And then we can redraw those curves. See, when you interpolate that curve, it doesn't close it. So right click on the P to make it periodic, and it will do that. Okay, so then we basically want to then reiterate through that over and over again, so that it will try to draw that curve with some sort of consistency and kind of make that grow. So to do that, we need our loop. So we'll start loop start and loop end be down here. And so we're going to feed in this curve. I'm going to connect these, and that curve's going to come out. Let's do that, say 4 times. I'm going to put okay, so it didn't like some things that are going on. Okay, so let's just keep this circle that if we start to grow something that doesn't have a center point, or can't use an arc to get that center point, then it doesn't work. So let's turn off a couple other things that are happening so we can see what is actually coming out of there. So it's growing, but it's just giving us the last one. So if we right click on here and say record data, it should show all of those. And right now it's just a basic offset. We're not changing that in any way. so it's not super special. So if we wanted to then move that in a different way, perhaps we want to take these angles and not just go directly out, but we can rotate them one way or the other. So let's rotate a vector. Right now we have these vectors down here. I'm going to take these vectors and we can rotate them, say 90 degrees. Actually, that's a bit much. Let's take them down to maybe 8. We need to right click and change this to degrees instead of radians. And then we want it to rotate around the z direction of these points. So it's in plane that we're looking at. So we're going to put a z down here and put these points in here because we don't want it to rotate around the z of the file. We want it to rotate around the z of the individual point. Let's see what this does. So maybe not a whole lot. Let's give it a couple more so we can see if that's just really slight. Actually, it does look like those are rotating, but it's not doing a whole lot to the overall thing. Okay, so let's try some more iterations of things to see if we get a better result. So right now we're just feeding in the curve, and we get out the curve. So what's happening is we don't have much possibility of changing that. So if we start to feed in maybe the vector, say the vector that we want to rotate it, we can sort of build it from the vector that we have. Actually, you know what? Right now it's a pretty consistent vector, so it's always a consistent rotation. Maybe we should try to randomize that a little bit so it goes in different directions and see if that starts to spread it out. So this vector right now is just rotating by a constant degree. If we give those different degrees, they should sort of change direction. So let's randomize this. So we have a random value going into there. And let's make a domain that goes positive to negative. Turn this down a little bit. You can see it's just making one value, so we want a value per each one of these things. So we can see how many there are. And make one for each one. Let's see if that does anything for us. Still looks relatively close to the same thing. Okay, there you go. Maybe it just wasn't turned up enough. So what you see here is happening is each one's rotating individually and it's starting to get away from that standard curve. And as we expand on that, you'll see that it starts to do some fairly interesting things as it moves up. Okay. So let's see if we can do some other things. I started talking about that a little bit. If we're feeding in the vector, then we can then adjust that vector each time. So right now we're making this vector inside the loop. If we feed it a vector, then we can say, okay, rotate that vector slightly each time rather than building from the center axis. So if I'm gonna move this outside. I'm gonna make a new division. So I can go ahead and start with something. And then I'm gonna say add a new input and a new output from each one of these. So we're going to start with this vector up here, plug it into there instead of using this one. And then the output of this vector rotation is going to go into that. And so we can change each one at each iteration. Good, so you can see that's a little different. And then the other thing I want to do is to say, okay, I start with 10 divisions. But what happens if I wanted to get more density to the curve or more resolution? So I can actually add, since there's a division here, I can actually add more subdivisions of that curve as we progress. So it should start to grow and change that over the course of the sequence. So that means I need a way of adding a number to this. Well, I have a counter right here. I can plug this in. But what happens if I restart this? That counter goes back to 0, and so I can't have 0 division. So I want some minimum. I'm going to use an expression on that n and say x plus 10. So I'm always going to have a minimum of 10 subdivisions. Let's see what that does. Gets a little more complicated as you go on, which is kind of interesting. But they're kind of jumbling up. So let's see if I can do some more things with that. Look, I changed this angle down to instead of 90, just 2 degrees, and that gives me a directionality, which actually does some really interesting things. Let's see what some other variations that might do. Those are pretty interesting. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to test and see what happens if I move this vertical each time. Seems like it might be a pretty nice face or something like that. I'm going to add a z unit to this vector. See what happens if I look at that in perspective. It does some pretty interesting things. So I can use that as a sort of growth algorithm to play around with new forms, but then also to sort of change a form consistently over time. I think that's it.